Right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this webinar. This is Navigating the EU Deforestation Regulation, How to Interpret and Prepare for EUDR Legality Requirements. My name is Marissa Brock. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs at Sourcemap. I'm joined here by Chloe Viala. She is the Traceability Specialist at Preferred by Nature. Welcome, Chloe. Thanks for joining this morning, or afternoon for you.
Yeah, early afternoon. Thanks, Marissa. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here.
Great. So I want to give a quick bio on Chloe, just to introduce her, and I'll obviously introduce myself as well. Chloe has been at Preferred by Nature since 2019. She supports stakeholders in developing and strengthening responsible sourcing practices, particularly on the implementation of due diligence and risk assessments on forest impact commodity supply chains. Chloe monitors development and traceability and the harmonization of approaches to due diligence and information gathering. She's also responsible for the Sourcing Hub team, which develops and shares country risk assessments, something that's particularly relevant in today's conversation. A little bit about Preferred by Nature. Preferred by Nature is a global not-for-profit with 30 plus years of experience in sustainability for the forestry and forest impact commodity sector. They support stakeholders to implement responsible production and sourcing practices through various activities. Those include as a certification body accredited to the most credible certification schemes, also by delivering advisory services on due diligence, and by implementing multi-stakeholder projects in key producing countries and consuming regions. Really excited to have Chloe joining today. Preferred by Nature is a really important player in this space and has a tremendous amount of experience in the risk assessment arena, but particularly as we talk about sort of the implications for the deforestation regulation and risk associated with that law. So again, thank you so much for joining, Chloe. As I mentioned, my name is Marissa Brock. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs at Sourcemap. At Sourcemap, we are a solution provider for supply chain due diligence, supply chain mapping, and monitoring risk in your end-to-end upstream supply chain. Sourcemap has been around for almost 15 years now and has been mapping and monitoring supply chains across industries and sectors. Over the last couple of years, we've really evolved to be a compliance solution, a regulatory compliance solution for companies as the world has changed and due diligence regulations have required supply chain mapping as a mandatory reporting requirement and due diligence requirement. So really excited to dive into today's discussion. We have a lot to cover, so hopefully we are able to cover all of our topics in the time that we have. Just to sort of center everyone and get everyone on the same page about what we'll be discussing today, the EU Deforestation Regulation has really been the law that's on everyone's minds and has been over the last few months. We're fast approaching the enforcement deadline for EUDR that goes into effect at the end of December of this year. So really rapidly approaching that deadline. But we've been talking about EUDR for years now. It feels like millennia, but it has only been the last couple of years. But there are still quite a few outstanding questions around what enforcement will look like, what implementation will look like, what the burden will be on companies in terms of all of the requirements that are listed in the full text of the regulation, and also that have been circulated in drafts of the implementation guidance over the last month or so. But really what we're going to be focused on today is what does legality look like under EUDR? This is a fairly open and somewhat controversial question, frankly, because there are a lot of open-ended questions that continue around what legality will look like and how the EU will approach the concept of legality. When we say legality, what we're talking about is the requirement in the deforestation regulation to comply with local, regional, national laws in your sourcing country. So while the primary objective of EUDR is to prevent products that were made using deforestation past a certain cutoff point from entering the EU market or being placed on the EU market or sold within the EU market, there also is a very critical component of the regulation that requires that compliance piece with local regulations and ensuring that you are aware as an operator, you are aware of pertinent and material local laws that must be adhered to as you're sourcing from those countries. So those laws can really cover a number of different categories, which we'll talk about a little bit today. But what I'd love to start with here, because this is for folks who have been following the deforestation regulation and perhaps were not aware of the law that predated EUDR and will eventually be superseded by the deforestation regulation, the EU timber regulation. So I want to open things up here and open this up to you, Chloe. Would love to hear you talk through what are some of the major differences in enforcement measures from the timber regulation to the deforestation regulation, and how might companies that perhaps were not super aware of the timber regulation because they were not exposed to those requirements, how might they understand the major differences between these two laws?
Sure, let's start with this. Thanks again for having us and for this great overview and introduction before diving in this very specific question. So yeah, on enforcement, there's two things we can say. So on paper, there's major differences that the EUDR is bringing compared to the EUTR. Amongst other things, there's like some percentages, some percent that competent authorities within each member state will have to comply with, and that's a risk-based approach. So there's like different that they'll have to fill for both operators and quantities of products entering the EU market. That's 9% for high-risk country, 3% for standard risk country, and 1% for low-risk country. This is quite new, so we're not super sure yet how competent authority will actually comply with that. One thing that we can anticipate, though, is that the largest operators and traders will very probably be systematically annually within the list of controls to perform. There's also quite a lot of details in terms of the sanctions and the repercussion, let's say, from controls. That's much more detailed and much larger, let's say, options than where with the EUTR, within the EUTR regulation. And also the third point is within the EUTR, custom authorities have had practically no space, basically. So that also impacted the way competent authority acted, and it was quite a barrier actually to identify the importers within the EU market. Now within the EUDR, the customs authorities have a much larger space, and so hopefully, or it's to be anticipated that will also make competent authority work and controls more efficient, more fluid, and more reactive than what we have been seeing with EUTR. So that's a couple elements on paper. I don't know if do you want me to just touch base on a few examples on how we saw controls happening within the EU timber regulation with the timber sector. Great. So again, those are just like common elements that we saw, but not necessarily representatives. Controls have been very different over different countries and with different types of entities. So it's bear that in mind, let's say. But what we've seen over the 15 plus years of implementation of the EU timber regulation is that usually controls were announced a little bit in advance to the operator being controlled. There was usually a one day on-site audit from the competent authority physically visiting companies. And then there were most of the time back and forth with the companies to request clarification or request adjustment from things that were left unclear or that were maybe non-compliance. there was a strong focus on the systems in place, so the due diligence systems in place, rather than, and the performance of the systems and how the system was perceived as being robust and efficient and strong enough. Yeah, we've seen a lot of notification actually for adjusting due diligence systems and a lot of more administrative sanction rather than legal sanctions. But again, that's just a very standard common process that we've seen. There's been other types of cases, but that's a pattern that was quite consistent under EUTR.
Thank you so much for that overview, Chloe. Would love to hear a little bit more about maybe some of the major differences across countries when we looked at EUTR enforcement, and how might that either parallel or represent a difference with EUDR.
So for sure, one thing that what will be common is that we have 27 states and they're each responsible for control. So there is differences in implementation to be expected. I don't think there's much to expect. I mean, they have been making efforts at aligning and communicating with each other, but nevertheless, there's still 27 member states, which each of those, like one major influence that we've seen is how decentralized the state is. And with some countries like Belgium, it's quite small and quite centralized, so that EUTR had a very team of experts doing all the controls for the whole country. France and Spain, on the other hand, are more heavily decentralized, and so they had like dozens of agents actually responsible for doing those controls. So it was the learning path was a bit steeper for those controlling agents that had other responsibilities, and there were dozens of them in the country. So training them is also more difficult than training a reduced team. So yeah, different levels of, and then there's also the different ministries might be involved. I think it's going to be even heavier now that we have both forest commodities and agricultural commodities. So that's a kind of split that might also trickle down in terms of who's doing the controls, that plus the custom level. Yeah, and it's been, so there's been different levels of skills and capacity within controlling agents, but it's been a learning path over the years for most of them, each at their different levels. And we've actually worked with a few Cameron Authority to do some training, awareness raising, capacity building. That's been a constant work stream over the year. So I expect this will continue to.
Absolutely, and something that we're really seeing, to your point about this really impacts all of the member states in the EU, and can have a disproportionate impact when we talk about the audit process under EUDR. We'll dive into that a little bit more as we proceed further into the webinar. But as most of you are aware, in the regulation, there is a requirement to audit 9% of goods that are coming from those high-risk countries once the EU does establish that list of high standard and low-risk countries. And when you look at that 9% audit, that can place a disproportionate burden on certain countries where they are importing a much higher volume of goods. Obviously, that's not an equivalent number of goods entering all of the countries within the EU. And then how do we think about how those countries actually stand up the mechanism to audit and establish all of the competent authorities that will be involved in that audit process? So the audit process in particular is definitely a large unknown when we think about EUDR. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like. Will that actually involve on-site visits? How frequently will those audits take place? We recognize that industry is fairly anxious to learn as much as they can about what the audit process looks like, and how countries will approach this, and how the Commission will approach this as well. But we don't know yet. I'm very anxious to see once the finalized implementation guidelines are released, as well as I believe we're waiting on an updated version of the FAQs a webpage that hopefully all of you have seen and perused. That was released several months back now. but we are anticipating an updated version as we approach the enforcement deadline, and would obviously be curious to see whether there's more information around what the audit process might look like in that FAQs document. So just to sort of continue this conversation a little bit more around EUTR, Chloe, based on the experience that you've had working with companies and really understanding that the timber regulation, what advice would you give to better prepare for controls related to the deforestation regulation?
Few simple things. Yeah, like you said, I acknowledge, like we have to acknowledge how frustrating it is not to be able to anticipate. And there's this component of we have to wait and see how each state is actually implementing those controls. Which is why the safest place to be as an operator or trader that might be under those types of control, the safest place to be is to really have a solid due diligence system in place and to be in full control of how the system operates. And that includes having extremely clear records of all the due diligence, supply chain mapping, collection of documentation, risk assessment, risk mitigation processes in terms of dates, who did it, when was it done. While you do due diligence, you have to think forward that a competent authority might ask you to go back to it 2 years in time, and that might be not you, might be your colleague. So there's an element of recording every step of the way that's super important, and of being able to navigate your due diligence systems. And I would say if you're an operator and you're in full control of all of that, and that includes if you're using third-party support providers like Sourcemap or Preferred by Nature, you still need to be in control of the whole process and need to be able to explain it and access those records. And that, I think, would be the best advice I could give, and that's the safest place to welcome a competent authority into your company. You know your company. The competent authority will not know your company. There might be less expert than you at this EU regulation. So the cleaner your records, your due diligence process, the best place you are to be confident and yeah, to go through this process.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on a really important point, Chloe. We're all learning through this process, not just industry, not just solution providers, but frankly, the commission, the competent authorities. This is a really transformative piece of legislation. And it really is unparalleled when you compare this to other due diligence, supply chain due diligence regulations around the world. And so the advice that I would sort of tack on to Chloe's advice is, this is really a regulation where you need to be over-prepared. Because there are still aspects that are unknown in terms of the level of enforcement and the level of the detail in the audit process. This really is a legislation where you can't be too prepared. There are a couple of points I'd love to touch on here just around why EUDR is so transformative and so different. The biggest reason is this really is an unprecedented scale in terms of reporting requirements. And by those reporting requirements, I'm primarily referring to the due diligence statement requirement. Because EUDR requires, that the main component of the legislation, mapping and verifying deforestation-free status, depending on which commodity you have exposure under EUDR, we could be talking thousands of farms. When we're looking at some of these really large operators, some of the companies that Sourcemap works with, this can be 10,000 times a year to 1 million times a year that they are placing products on the EU market. When you really qualify that and look at that scale, this just is not something where you can be manually pulling all of the information that's required for a due diligence statement. Compared to other pieces of legislation, there really isn't a way to do this in Excel spreadsheets and just paper record keeping. This really has to be an automated process when you look at the primary due diligence requirements under EUDR. And again, I'm talking about that deforestation analysis piece and the generating of the due diligence statements based on that information. I know we're focused primarily today on the legality aspect, but I do sort of want to continue to center things around the overarching kind of objective of the regulation, which, again, is that a prohibition of products made with deforestation from being placed on the market. And then when we think about the what's at stake for EUDR, goods just cannot enter the EU without a compliant due diligence statement, which is very different from other pieces of legislation. I think about the U.S. forced labor ban, for example, which prior to EUDR was oftentimes thought of as the strictest supply chain due diligence legislation because of the rebuttable presumption of forced labor. There were a lot of pieces about the U.S. forced labor ban that was very different from similar due diligence legislation. But it did not, so it was more of it continues to be more of a reactive legislation than proactive. While Sourcemap recommends that you approach all of these regulations with a proactive approach, when you look about the U.S. forced labor ban, goods are detained at the U.S. border and investigations ensue as a result of those detentions, and companies can contest those detentions. But with EUDR, you either have a compliant due diligence statement or you don't. If you are attempting to place a good on the market and, for example, you have not compiled a due diligence statement, it just will not be allowed in to the market. So there's a potential, pretty significant financial burden on companies placing their goods on the market if they're not able to, if their goods are not able to enter the market. And then if you're found to be non-compliant with the regulation, the 4% of your global annual turnover fine, that is a really significant financial burden. And what I think is really critical to think of here is some of these products that are transformed multiple times. So think about products that perhaps the raw materials are imported, the raw commodities are imported into the EU, and then they are transformed into a derived product well within the EU. And that derived product has an HS code that's listed in the annex of the regulation, so still in scope of the regulation, and therefore needs to reference a compliant due diligence reference number. There can be shared liability with those fines. So it's not just a single operator within the value chain that may receive that 4% fine. So really cannot emphasize enough what's at stake here. This really is a major piece of legislation when you think about scale and impact. So, we're really watching this closely and curious to see and eager to see what this will look like in practice. I want to shift gears a little bit here and really focus on EUDR legality. What does it mean? And what are both Sourcemap and Preferred by Nature's recommendations around sort of legality, the legality approach under EUDR? So just to set the stage, in regards to legality, the EU states that the obligation to collect documents or other information pertaining to this legality requirement noted in the law should be interpreted broadly. And in the implementation guidelines draft, which have been kind of circulating, perhaps some of you have seen this, the finalized version has not been published. But the EU says the higher the risk of corruption in a specific case, the more it is necessary to collect additional evidence of compliance to mitigate the risk of non-compliant products entering or leaving the EU market. So what does that mean? The Commission is actually recommending that companies start by looking at Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, the acronym for that is CPI, as a good benchmark for determining if further documentation pertaining to legality should be considered. So that means, you're sourcing from a particular country, you're collecting polygons for farms in that country. You look at where that country falls on the CPI, the Corruption Perceptions Index. The Commission is saying a low CPI score means, a high CPI score shows that further verification may be required. So that's saying the country is scoring high as having corruption based on the standards established by the Corruption Perceptions Index. And so it's likely that standard and high-risk countries will require additional document collection. The EU is also recommending third-party verification and certification schemes will be helpful in identifying whether additional evidence is required for higher risk countries, and also providing evidence of those certification schemes can also serve as that additional evidence, because there are requirements around legality that may be baked into some of those certification schemes. So I want to talk quickly about the areas that the EU lists as the legal categories that when they're thinking about legality, these are the legal categories that they're thinking of: land use rights, environmental protection, forest-related rules, that includes forest management and biodiversity conservation. That's directly related to wood harvesting. So think about some of the overlap between the timber regulation, the prior timber regulation, and EUDR. Third parties' rights, labor rights and human rights protected under international law. Those can be things like forced labor and child labor, and then, of course, labor rights as a broad category. The principle of free, prior, and informed consent, and then tax, anti-corruption, trade, and customs regulations. So, of course, those are some categories that are incredibly broad. That essentially sounds like every law in the world is covered under EUDR. But really what they're expecting here is, establishing the precedent that you should be compliant with the laws from the country that you're sourcing from, period. But they really are emphasizing that as a requirement under the Deforestation Regulation. And the fact that they are specifically saying a flexible approach is they want companies to really think about which of these categories are the most relevant, the most material, and perhaps have the highest risk. Meaning, if you are sourcing from a country that does not have an established process for documenting land use rights, or proving that you actually have the rights to operate, own, or work on the land in question, how do you establish that you do have those rights? How do you actually establish, in the event of an audit, how can you prove that you have the rights to operate that land? That's a fairly complex question, and it's very dependent on the countries that you are sourcing from. This can look very different. Some countries have really established documentation specifically when we're thinking about things like agricultural production and farming, but others do not. So, Chloe, what I'd love to open things up to you here is just around the concept of document collection when we think about EUDR and EUDR legality. When might an operator need to provide documents showing or proving legality to competent authorities? How is Preferred by Nature thinking about this, and how are we interpreting the requirements under the law?
So two things to start with. First of all, just a reminder that while submitting due diligence statement, there is no attached evidence of legality. What you have to attach when doing due diligence statements is the geospatial coordinates, and then a declaration that the due diligence has been done. So just as a reminder that those evidence of legality, whether they're documents or other types of evidence, will sit in your due diligence systems and within the tools that you're using to do this due diligence. So that's one thing to consider. So you will have to show those documents, but not only the documents, the whole suite of the tools, your systems, the rationale, your risk mitigation actions. That can be certification schemes, that can be on-site visits and other verification types of activities. All of that, you should be able to display it once and if you're controlled by competent authorities. So just to clarify this point, so that also means that there's a necessity to have really highly proficient storage systems so that you can keep track and you can store and record all of those documents that led you prior to importing into the EU to say there's a negligible risk of illegality here, so I'm placing the product on the market. I'd like to take a small step back from EUDR just to explain from a more generally best practice due diligence perspective, what's the connection between document collection and due diligence? And then I'll land back to EUDR, if you allow me. So we often, very often, and this is quite natural and normal here, which documents should I collect? And that's specifically because when you're sitting at the other end of a supply chain, then collecting documents via emails is just much more easier than going on site and doing other types of activities. But we have been consistently advising to think a bit backward in terms of there's a first step of collecting evidence, collecting documentation which is specific to supply chain mapping and kind of understanding the journey of your products. So that's a specific category of document that you can start collecting right away. And we very often advise to go beyond just purely declarations. And depending on the type of supply chain, you might have to require sample invoices or just trade evidence so that you can have confidence on the integrity of your supply chain back to an area of production. So that's one first type of document that you might want to focus on. Once you have that in place and you've identified the area, national region, type of supply chain, type of actors in your supply chains, for us, as like due diligence starts by asking yourself, what is the risk levels associated to that supply chain that I have? And so it's more like about identifying the legality in place. If we look at legal compliance in the country of production, so it's about understanding what's the legal framework in this country, overlaying that with the governance. So how well implemented are those requirements, those legal requirements, and what's the risk at, let's say, country level or maybe subnational level? What's the risk that this legal requirement that the state has placed on actors is actually not implemented? Because if there's a risk that this legal requirement is not well implemented, then that's up to me to kind of fill in and do extra diligence so that I will address this risk. And what do you do to address the risk or to mitigate the risk is actually really depending on understanding what the risk is. So I can give you an example. So if the risk is the absence of a document, like an absence of land use or land tenure document, or the absence of a forest management plan, or the absence of authorization XYZ, then very logically to address that risk, you would require the document. And that's quite an easy risk mitigation that you have here. But there are other risks, and I'm going to give an example that might be quite specific to the timber sector, but if there is a risk that the operator is logging the forest before the authorization, like the annual authorization is issued, or is kind of logging outside of its annual area that's delimited in the forest, which documents are you going to require? Child labor might be another frustrating one. Which document are you going to require to mitigate risks of child labor in the supply chain? So we tend to advise within the due diligence process, so risk-based approaches would be really to define the risk as best as you can to then jump to the risk mitigation. That might be document collection and might be something different, might be on-site visit, might be certification, might be changing practices, might be training your supply chains, shortening your supply chains. It's really depending on what the risk is. So that's kind of the thought process that sometimes help you figure out which documents you actually need versus which documents you feel like you need because there's a bit of a panic of like, the more documents I have, the better, the more confident I feel. But that's not going to help justify this supply chain is low risk of illegality because X, Y, Z. And I know the context and I know. So CPI is exactly, that's a good input for risk assessment. It's not the only one. There's other ways and other sources of information to kind of evaluate within this country, within this context. Okay, the legality is this, and this is the legal documents that people should have in place. How much now should I collect? Well, that depends on the level of implementation within that context requirements. EUDR is making a bit of an extra step in that it's actually requiring a lot of information collection on top of the risk assessment process. So that's a bit, there should be for each country, once you identify the legal framework, a bit of a standard minimum list of documents and information you would want to collect, and then move on to the risk assessment and risk mitigation, depending on what the context is. Yeah. Is that clear, Marissa?
It is, and thank you so much for walking us through that, Chloe. I think that for companies that are concerned about doing this at scale, what I will say is the way in which you should be approaching, or companies should be approaching legality under EUDR is really to incorporate this into your existing due diligence process moving forward. I mean, from what we understand, EUDR does not appear to be going anywhere anytime soon. If this continues, this will really transform, just as we've been saying throughout this webinar, the standard due diligence process for goods entering the EU. And really permanently transform that due diligence process. So what does that mean? That means that companies that already have an established due diligence process for their goods, which really every company has, those may vary in terms of the level of detail, whether they have, again, third-party certifications, whether they're deploying on-site audits. That can really look different depending on the company, particularly depending on the size of the company. But really incorporating some of the concepts of EUDR legality and some of those legal categories that I mentioned earlier, kind of how the EU Commission is thinking about legality, those 7 categories. Incorporating those into your due diligence process is really a critical step as we approach the enforcement deadline. And as we've said, I just want to sort of be a broken record here and reiterate, we don't know what the audit process will look like. No one knows at this stage how significant those audits will look. But as we've been saying, you don't want to be caught unprepared. You don't want to have done none of the required due diligence pertaining to legality and only focusing on the deforestation component of EUDR, even though, as I've said, that is the most important component. That really is the kind of crux of the law. The objective of the law is to, prohibit goods made from deforestation from entering the EU. But now is the time to start to stand up a more robust due diligence process that covers some of these areas so that you aren't scrambling to pull this together, on December 20th. That is too late. So it really is important to start to think about this now. You're not going to have all of the answers. No one is going to have all of the answers today, but this really is the time to begin to pull a lot of this information together. I know we're coming up on the end of the webinar here. We have a few minutes left. Chloe, are there any resources and efforts that you want to share around sort of what Preferred by Nature is doing? Anything that might be useful to our audience here?
That's actually a very good segue into, I was going to bounce back on what you just said, like in terms of scaling up, actually. So that might be very scary to have those big 8 areas of law and so many countries of production. We believe that this is exactly why we need shared understanding of the legality framework and context, and evaluate like risk assessment within producing countries that's open to everyone, that competent authority can check, and you can say, I'm using this, and they have access to it too. So there's a shared understanding of this legal framework, the governance and risk level of non-compliance in those countries. And you can even top it up with the use of certification system or other third-party assurance systems, other types of systems that can help. There's a huge need for benchmarking the systems and for shared understanding of what it is that they cover and what it is that there might be gaps that you might need to act on and top it up. So that's something we're constantly trying to do. We have currently a lot of data on timber legality that we're expanding to other commodities, other areas of law. We have our EUDR set of, so the 8 areas of legality we've kind of break it down into more sub areas of law, which we believe is necessary to have this kind of standardized, shared producing country profiles. So that's something and we don't want to be alone in this conversation. We're calling this our sourcing hub. There's a user interface right now, but we're thinking of many other ways to actually share this data, making it available to everyone and making everyone contribute to actually build this data set and this collective understanding. We're talking to other actors within the Risk Information Alliance currently. So yeah, that's a strong belief that there's a path. It might not be fully ready by December 2024, this efforts of standardizing, aligning, having a shared understanding. It might be a bit of a longer term objectives, but we're very much welcoming anyone joining this conversation because there's a clear need to align our knowledge on those producing countries for EUDR to happen.
Absolutely. And what I will sort of emphasize on top of what Chloe has said is particularly the way we're approaching things at Sourcemap is, collaboration is essential here. Making sure that we are in close communication with other experts in this space, like Preferred by Nature, it is really an essential piece of the puzzle. Because EUDR is such a complex legislation, and again, it really is transformative compared to other regulations and directives coming out of the EU. It is important to share knowledge and collaborate. And so we urge any of the folks who participated in this call, if you have any questions that we didn't get a chance to cover, any of those burning questions, I'm sure there are so many. We've been answering questions in the Q&A live throughout the course of this webinar. But if there are any burning questions that we didn't get a chance to cover, you'd like to reach out to Sourcemap or Preferred by Nature, please do. We'll post our contact information when we send out the recording at the conclusion of this webinar. So anyone who registers, you will have a contact for both of our organizations in that email. And again, please do not hesitate to ask those questions. Questions are how we all learn and continue to collaborate as we approach the enforcement deadline for EUDR. So I want to thank Chloe in particular for participating in this webinar. I know that the time went by fast, but we'll continue this conversation. I think there definitely will be opportunities for future webinars to sort of dive deep on some of the areas of the regulation that we didn't get a chance to cover today. But I want to thank you, Chloe, for a great conversation and for sharing the knowledge that you have and that Preferred by Nature has today.
Well, thanks for having us. And yeah, it's always interesting to follow up on those discussions and to bounce ideas back and forth and keep sharing the expertise and knowledge.
Of course, absolutely. Again, for folks who dialed in and perhaps have colleagues who were not able to participate, we will be circulating the recording of this webinar. So thank you again. And I hope everyone has a lovely Thursday and a safe and restful weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.